Thank you very much, Ms. Coke-Hamilton, and thank you to UNCTAD for inviting us, and TRACIT for inviting us to participate in this event. I'd like to congratulate you and TRACIT because of the fact that last year we had about half of the people that we have in this room today. So I think you got a lot of interest out of the event last year, and this is an item that has become more and more important for sustainable development and for discussion on how to stop illicit trade. Could I have my presentation put on the screen, please? Maybe I'll start with some discussion about CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Plants and Animals, of fauna and flora. As you may know, it is a convention that has 183 parties, the European Union also being a party to CITES. It was agreed in 1973 and came into being established in 1975. We have covered through CITES 36,000 species, and some may be surprised about the fact that of these 36,000 species, 30,000 are plants. We often talk about terrestrial mammals, animals, as part of CITES, but it is surprising to understand later that it is actually covering more plants than animals. CITES works by putting animals and plants in appendices. We have Appendix 1, 2, and 3. In Appendix 1, it's only about 3% of the species that are listed under CITES, and these species cannot be traded at all. It is completely illegal to have any sort of commerce with these species. However, another surprising fact that under Appendix 2, international trade can take place, but it has to be regulated by each of the parties to the convention and non-parties as well. If non-parties wish to trade in these endangered species that are CITES listed, then they have to also be able to regulate them according to CITES regulations. So imagine this great number, 97% of these 36,000 species that can be traded. Imagine the work that is entailed to be able to know what these species look like, how to identify these species. I have here with us my colleague from the World Customs Organization. Imagine the work of the customs officials to have to identify all of these species that can be traded and identify those that cannot be traded. Okay, so I'll tell you when to stop. Go ahead and move forward on the slides, please. Or is there a... If you can go to the 6th slide that's titled Legal Trade in Wildlife. This one, thank you. So of those 97% that we were talking about, these are able to enter legal trade in wildlife. And if you think about the world and how we use biodiversity, it's 7 billion people who use biodiversity every single day, so it's very important for humankind. Millions of people are depending on plants and animals, not only as their food, but also as their livelihood. So this is why it's so very important for us to have this legal trade that is highly regulated by CITES concerning endangered species. And of course, the whole goal and the aim of CITES is to be able to make sure that this trade is legal, sustainable, and traceable, and does not threaten their existence in the wild for future generations. In a year's time, the regulations of CITES is through permits, and in a year's time, we have about 850,000 permits that are being released. Next, please. Some of the areas that you probably know that are common in legal trade in wildlife are, for example, for the materials that are used for housing and furniture, for creating pharmaceuticals, vaccines, herbal medicines, research, for cosmetics, also in the cosmetic industries, wax, oils, food, some specialties like caviar, all sorts of fish. We know now that we have several listed species of sharks, which are also part of the international trade, wild meat and plants. and of course leather and fashion. There are many, many more, but as you can see, it's legal trade is very, very important for livelihoods for people on this earth, and this is why we have to take care of these animals and plants to ensure that they are not endangered and lost to extinction. Next, please. Now more and more parties of CITES, the governments are relying on CITES to ensure that the trade is sustainable and legal, and we see that they are now increasing the number of species on the CITES lists of appendices. For example, marine species and timber species, which would have not been listed on CITES before, are now being listed in large numbers. Next. So the next part is about, that I would like to talk to you a little bit is about the work that we do on combating illegal trade in wildlife under CITES. Next, please. There are two sides to enforcement. It's not only the enforcement side, but the compliance side, and therefore CITES regulates international trade also for the legal aspects to ensure that governments are aware of what kinds of regulations, what kinds of measures that they have to put in place at the national level to be able to do this trade. But then, of course, they also have to have national measures to stop illegal trade, to be able to recognize are they able to trade, and not only as a source country, but also as a transit and destination country, because non-compliance has really serious implications for biodiversity and for species extinctions. Some of you may be familiar with the release last year of this global assessment by the IPBES showing that we are now in a state of extinction, the sixth highest extinction period that is coming to us if we are not taking care of the species, given the fact that there are many threats to them, one of them habitat loss, but the second major threat to species is overexploitation. Next. So it's a serious and global threat. It is now have been confronted, of course, by illegal trade for decades, but now we see that the spike in scale has increased exponentially. It is recognized more and more that illegal wildlife trade is a serious crime. It is now become increasingly important for countries to be able to raise wildlife crime as any other crime of significance, such as drugs crime, human trafficking, etc., where the sanctions against those who are importing and exporting are very high, because otherwise there is no incentive for them to stop doing it. Many of them are really high value. If you think about pangolin scales, if you think about ivory, these are all very high scale, high value on the market, and this increases the incentive for the trade in these materials, and many of them are now organized crime groups that are becoming involved. And in fact, it has turned into something that's at the industrial scale. If you hear about seizures that are happening now in many ports like Hong Kong, in Thailand, for example, we're talking 50,000 animals died, 50,000 pangolins have died for a few bags of scales, of pangolin scales. Imagine the impact of that kind of industrial killing of animals and how that will impact the species. Next, please. The UNODC produced a report on illegal trade in 2016. There's a new report that should be coming out this year, and it shows that about 7,000 species are entering wildlife crime. If you look at the graph that we have here, something that also may be surprising to many is that, in fact, timber, and particularly rosewood, has the highest amount of illegal trade, which is 35%. Then comes the elephant, which is mostly in terms of the tusk, and ivory at 18%. Then there's reptiles, parrots, marine turtles, rhinoceros, pangolins, agarwords, big cats, tortoise and freshwater turtles, corals, and sturgeons. These are occupying the rest of the graph. But as I said, surprising to many is the increase in the rosewood illegal trade. Next, please. It is, for example, if we look at the various animals and plants that are in danger, with elephants, they have declined by 111,000 numbers in recent years. Pangolins specimens, as I've mentioned before, at alarming rates, the number of pangolins that are caught, pangolin scale seizures in the thousands of kilos at a time. Seizures of live tigers have also increased per year in the period between 2000 and 2012. And one issue that is becoming increasingly worrisome is the situation of the vaquita in Mexico, in the Sea of Cortez, in the Gulf of California, where it's practically been wiped out. We believe that maybe if optimistic estimates, that there remain between 50 and 20 specimens of vaquita left in the Gulf of California because of the fishing of a fish called totoaba for its bladder, because it is believed in traditional Chinese culture that this will give you strength by eating the bladder of this totoaba fish. And when they catch the totoaba, they also, as bycatch, catch the vaquita and have almost eliminated it. Next. Another area, and some say this is my favorite subject because I think it's something that's very obscure and nobody knows about, the importance of European eels. Imagine that over the past years, up to now in 27, 28, the increase of glass eel seizures. The glass eels are the baby eels that are used to be able to create the captive breeding in aquaculture, mostly in China and Asia. Look at the amount that has changed from 2011 to 2017 and 18, and this is because of the increasing attraction of eating eels, particularly in sushi, and it has become widespread. It used to be going towards one direction, the trade towards Asia, but now we see it coming back towards North America as well, where many of the seizures are taking place now. Next. And here this graph shows some of the main flows of rosewood, which I had mentioned before, of timber, illegal timber trading that is happening between those that are the source countries. It may be hard to see, but the major source country is Madagascar, and most of the trade is going towards China. It was mentioned before that China has now put in place some regulations to stop the illegal trade. I think this is an important area for private sector because most of the trade is directed towards furniture making. Next, please. And here you can see in terms of the metric tons of seizures that have been happening in the last years between 2007 and 2015. The great majority of seizures are happening in China, and this is good news. It is something that is alarming, but at the same time, it is good news that things are changing and that seizures are higher. And then also the type of rosewood is the Malagasy rosewood that is taking place illegally, trading illegally, as well as some other types of rosewood. But rosewood is really such a precious wood that is the one that is being decimated across the world. Next, please. Another area where we have seen an increased amount of trade is in live tortoises and freshwater. You can see where it's the darkest is where the majority of the trade is happening. That is in Asia and in Europe. And one of the areas at which we're paying a lot of attention to is the pet trade under CITES, because we think that for collectionists this is going to be, and especially in the dark web on the internet, we're seeing a lot of trade in pets that are special, that have some characteristics that collectionists want, especially, for example, the glass frog, which we are now watching, which has the underbelly is completely transparent, where you can see all of the organs inside. This is very attractive to collectionists, and there's a big worry that this is the next species that's going to be traded, mostly illegally and at high numbers to affect the species' survival. Next, please. The World Bank just recently released a report, a very important report. We've always heard numbers of what it costs, what is legal trade costs, and here they've been able to make an estimate that it costs between $1 trillion to $2 trillion per year. And in many low-income countries who rely on natural resources and biodiversity for their livelihoods, it's estimated that governments are foregoing between $7 and $12 billion in potential fiscal revenue, such as taxes, etc., for those species that are being traded. Next, please. So it's a serious and global threat. One of the things that we have to keep in mind that it does affect the legal trade. There is legal trade in wildlife, and it is affected by this increase in illegal trade. It compromises, of course, the security of the supply chain. And one very important area that we have to dedicate a lot of resources to, and that all of our partners working with us are very concerned with, is this involvement of international criminal organizations. Very hard to fight them, but it's the same, they're getting the same profits as they do from any other type of illegal activity, so very hard to defeat them. But they add on, they not only deal with wildlife crime, but they also deal with other types of crime. Next, please. Thank you. That helps, thank you. So how the CITES regulate this is through resolutions and decisions, to first for the interpretation of the convention, but also to give short time-bound instructions to parties on how to deal with legal trade, but also illegal trade. And one new resolution that was from COP18, which just occurred last year here in Geneva, was a new decision, a new resolution to design about designating the management authorities in each country and urging them to cooperate very closely with all the authorities dealing with enforcement. And this is also why I'm pleased to see my colleague from the WCO, because we work together very closely between the CITES management authorities, the customs organizations. Interpol is also another partner. The police have to work, and they have to establish mechanisms to be able to communicate with each other. And some of the progress we've seen is that this has been happening at an increased scale now, the communication between the authorities. They also have to coordinate with the preparation of an annual illegal trade report. From the resolutions and decisions of CITES, we have now prepared many materials to be able to encourage parties and give them guidance on how to control illegal wildlife trade. Here we have a copy of a report from the UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, indicating how to scale back corruption and promote the use of the guide to be able to know what the risks are, assess the risks at each country, and find ways in which to deal with the risk of corruption, for example, that has really a big impact on wildlife crime. The other area that I mentioned was these annual illegal trade reports that we asked countries. This started in 2017. We're getting some feedback. All countries, and I ask you as representatives of your missions here to urge your authorities to deliver on these annual illegal trade reports, because this really forms the basis to be able to make assessments and to know how to respond to this illegal crime. It is completely confidential. We do not transmit the information that is given to us by countries, but we do use it to be able to see where the wildlife crime is occurring and how to combat it. Two other instruments that we have under CITES are the MIC and the ETIS. One is on monitoring the illegal killing of elephants, and the other is on elephant trade information systems, by determining how much poaching is increasing or decreasing through MIC, and training wildlife officials on the ground. And the elephant trade information system helps us know where the seizures are occurring and what is going on with the ivory trade. Of course, nobody can work on this alone. As I mentioned, we have to work all together amongst the authorities, the CITES authorities, the police, customs, also the judicial system, and engaging in partnerships and coordination is essential. And the good news is that it's not going unnoticed. We have seen an increasing attention to international wildlife crime. There's a collective effort we have seen from many countries, many meetings, many important ministerial meetings taking place, talking about how to combat illegal wildlife trade. One of the areas that we know also in terms of government decisions, resolutions by the Global Assembly, to be able to urge countries and parties to take measures against illegal wildlife trade. The community, the civil society is more and more informed to stop poaching, and we have now, of course, targets within the Sustainable Development Goals to address illegal wildlife trade. One of the mechanisms that we have created in the last years to be able to respond to illegal wildlife trade is through IQWIC, which is the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime. And this is between CITES, Interpol, UNODC, the World Bank Group, and the World Customs Organization. We have a number of donors, as you see here, the European Union, France, Germany, Monaco, the UK, and the US contributing to these programs. We all join forces, and what's important here is that we're joining forces at the international level to encourage joining forces at the national level, each within their own mandate, but we are working together and communicating together, which is the most important part of combating illegal trade. We create documents, guidelines, reports, assessments to be able to make them available to parties, to give them guidance on how to combat illegal trade, how to make assessments, and proof of how it's working is through Operation Thunderball. I won't say very much about that because I'm sure WCO will mention it, but look at how many seizures were over the time that they did Operation Thunderball in 2019, involving 109 countries, the seizures of ivory, pangolin scales, tortoises and turtles, and timber. Many plants, live birds, marine species, and live reptiles. So we see that governments are more and more interested in combating illegal wildlife crime and taking the measures and investing in it to be able to combat this trade. Again, contributions that are being made under programs by France, by programs by the UK, many millions being invested to be able to combat the trade. And finally, some good news about making progress. We are making progress. We can see by, for example, through Thunderball, the countries that are becoming more and more involved. I visited China, where they have proven that they are trying to take measures to increase the seizures. We are seeing now that there's a small dip in the amount of poaching of elephants and the trade in ivory. And we see also that the number of rhinos that have been poached in previous years has now decreased to lower levels in 2018. So all of this arises that there is some good news, but much more work needs to be done. I believe that through this, as was said earlier by Jeff, through raising awareness about what is the legal trade and helping with the different authorities cooperating with each other at the national level, we'll be able to defeat wildlife crime. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Director Cook-Hamilton. Thanks for organizing this great event between UNCTAD and TRACIT. Very glad to be here. Our Deputy Minister of Trade, Ms. Laura Valdivieso, sends her most sincere apologies for not being able to travel to Geneva this time. She had to deal with an emergency back home in Bogota, and she wasn't able to come to Geneva. But she asked me kindly to step in on her behalf, so I'm willing to do that and to talk to you about what we're doing back in Colombia regarding illicit trade. Before that, I must say, and without the means of undermining my own presentation or Mr. Kush's presentation, but I'm very glad as an international gender champion to be sitting here in a panel of strong, empowered women behind and fighting for this very important topic that we have in front of us, that is illicit trade. So having said that, I would like first to start presenting what's our understanding of illicit trade and how we're dealing with it. So for Colombia, illicit trade has, and it's been explained before, two main, let's say, alternatives of scenarios. One is the actual trade of illicit goods or services, or illegal goods and services, and the other one is legal trade with illegal purposes. So that's trade of legal goods, legal services, but let's say with an underlying purpose of legal issues. And that's how we've been dealing and, let's say, structuring and implementing our public policy back in Colombia to fight against both scenarios. Currently, as an ambassador before the WTO, I'm the chair of the WTO negotiations for fishery subsidies. And I've heard 3 times already in this panel and before this panel mentions to illegal fishing or to unregulated fishing. And I can't but address this issue as well in a sense of connecting the dots of what we're doing in the WTO, what UNCTAD is doing, what TRACIT is doing, what the WCO is doing as well, what CITES is doing, and see how all these different organizations and even non-governmental organizations are working towards fighting this illegal trade or illicit trade in different aspects, both, again, in both scenarios. The trade of illegal goods or services, or the trade of goods and services that deal or have underlying illegal purposes. So having said that, I'm going to move to my presentation on what Colombia is doing currently for fighting illicit trade. So Colombia's international trade policy revolves around 3 main pillars and 1 horizontal principle. 3 pillars are the maximizing benefits from trade agreements, the trade facilitation strategy to improve the competitiveness of Colombia, and the attraction of foreign investment. And all this is supported by a horizontal principle that is legal and fair trade. So the legality levels the playing field in international trade. That enables competition under conditions of fairness and equality for everybody. This is something that, again, in the WTO we're working towards, and that's something that the WTO represents. Fair trade, fair practices, let's say, level playing field. And ultimately, we believe that legal trade is not just an important strategy. It's more of a precondition for the pillars of our trade policy to effectively work. I want to talk to you about the creation of our interinstitutional commission we created in Colombia that deals almost specifically with the fight of illicit trade. There's 11, say, sub-strategies within this commission. I'm going to go very quickly through them and then zoom in onto three or four one of these methodologies. So the first one is to improve the methodology to quantify smuggling by economic activity and sector, while fixing indicators to measure both the evolution over time of smuggling and contraband, as well as the policy response impact on each sector affected by this kind of illicit trade. This is one of the objectives of this interinstitutional commission. The second objective is to set up, within the Office of the Attorney General of Colombia, a specialized unit formed by prosecutors and judicial police, specialized in the fight against crimes of contraband and tax evasion. The third is to strengthen security at the border by improving joint actions between the police, the army, and the relevant government agencies involved in encountering illicit trade. And fourth, to strengthen interinstitutional coordination for the fight against smuggling, money laundering, and tax evasion. A fifth objective of this interinstitutional commission is to raise awareness of smuggling as transnational organized crime and to strengthen bilateral and multilateral actions in terms of cooperation between WTO members, their customs and security agencies. 6, to strengthen public education and prevention. 7, to strengthen public-private partnerships to fight illicit trade through the implementation of initiatives such as sectoral technical anti-smuggling committees. 8, to propose and table the modification and or issuance of regulations to counteract smuggling, money laundering, and tax evasion. 9, to identify and update international good practices to counteract contraband, money laundering, and tax evasion activities. 10, to improve management of technical facilities, infrastructure, labs, and equipment set forth fighting illicit trade. And finally, the 11th objective of this interinstitutional commission is to discuss and promote the institutional transformation of the Tax and Customs Authority in Colombia to face an increasingly complex world. So I'm going to zoom in on three alternatives, three of these strategies. One is Initiative 4, that deals with the strengthening of interagencies coordination in the fight against illicit trade, and particularly smuggling, money laundering, and tax evasion. So there's an interagency special task force to tackle illicit trade that was organized. Such task force is composed by government officials with a diverse background in Colombia, being able to carry out joint operations in real time at a national level. I will show afterwards some results of this task force. Also to design of an integrated anti-contraband permanent police centers, we call it in Spanish CIPA, with the purpose of linking different platforms and databases that make it possible to obtain and analyze information, both regional and sectorial. On Initiative 5, that is to raise awareness of smuggling as transnational organized crime, we're working on the implementation strategy to reach mutual administrative assistance agreements and MOUs with customs agencies of other countries. And also, a bilateral and multilateral cooperation is in our interest when oversighting the proper implementation of our trade promotion policy. I'll also touch upon this later in the presentation. Let's assume on Initiative 7, that is to promote public-private partnerships against illicit trade. So this public-private partnership centers to dialogue on illicit trade. We have 2 on textiles and apparel, spirits and tobacco, agriculture and food, drugs and pharmaceutical products, and e-commerce, goods and shipments. Right there you see 4 of the agencies that are currently part of these PPP centers. That is the Ministry of Trade, DIAN is our Customs and Tax Authority in Colombia, the Police of Colombia, and this is the Information and Financial and Analytics Unit, the UIAF. What are the main actions of these PPP centers? It's the coordination, exchange of experiences, and feedback on enforcement activity, the mutual assistance and exchange of information, discussing on regulatory improvement, training of customs officials with private connoisseurs, discussions of business formalization, and fostering the use of advanced import declarations. Now I want to show you some of the results and figures in Colombia that are part of the result of these strategies that have been enforced several years ago. This is only in 2019. There has been 29,645 enforcement actions in Colombia. As a result of those actions, there's been 95 millions of units of goods seized that represent more or less $100 million. It's the value of the equivalent value of those seized goods. Also, 138 containers have been seized, 217 warehouse seized as well, and 858 trucks and cars seized. These are very big numbers for Colombian trade, and this has been a direct result of the strategies that I've just explained. There's been 39 criminal structures were dismantled. And these are criminal structures not only, as I mentioned before, not only dealing with the trade of illegal goods or services, but also criminal structures in their underlying purpose of developing criminal activities that involve trade. 398 criminals tracked down and captured, and 359 criminals caught by surprise in flagrante delicto, meaning right there doing these criminal activities. So I'd like to draw with some conclusions more on a multilateral basis on our fight against this illicit trade. And I want to talk very briefly about the WTO as well. The WTO covered agreements do not provide for a definition of illicit trade. This means that in general the WTO scope of its agreements encompass both licit trade and illicit trade, and it's for the member affected to prove in which cases they're dealing with illicit trade or not. However, the organization is clearly devoted to the promotion of fair trade without distortions. And this is why Colombia has been very active and very vocal in encouraging the WTO to deliver in this respect. We need to have a multilateral discussion to define what is the scope of the WTO agreements regarding illicit trade. So thus we need first to improve the comprehension of the illicit trade problem at the WTO by exchanging members' views on the phenomenon. Second, work between WTO, UNCTAD, and UN-related agencies could help in this respect by investigating the phenomenon and elaborating on its real magnitude. And that's something that this forum is working a lot for us. Third, to this effect, the creation of an ad hoc anti-illicit trade working group would help to improve the comprehension of the illicit trade problem by opening the room to discuss it among members. So currently, UNCTAD is the main thinker to develop multi-party trade policy alternatives. And with UNCTAD and TRACIT and its partners, such as AB InBev, we can foster a public-private partnership at a multilateral level to raise awareness and develop joint policy instruments to tackle illicit trade. And Colombia is looking forward to keep working both with UNCTAD, TRACIT, and its private members as well. We thus propose, first, to design and implement an illicit trade mitigation toolkit that can be shared with the UN member states to serve the dual objectives of fighting illicit trade and achieving the UN SDGs. And second, to discuss a multilateral dialogue on illicit trade fight and implementation of SDGs, harmonization of international law dealing with illicit trade, including WTO. And after hearing some of the other presentations prior than mine, I think that one of the forums where we can deliver and start discussing this having this multilateral dialogue is also UNCTAD at 50. So I would encourage members, WTO members, but also member states in the UN to think about this opportunity to deliver a dialogue on multilateral basis and UNCTAD at 50. So having said that, just like to thank you for hearing this presentation.